So I want to talk again about, well I say again, mostly I do talk about the gospel readings when I preach here, and I do want to talk about this one from Luke 16 that Phil just read to us. It's interesting, I've mentioned in the sermons somewhat some time ago that most of the stories in the Gospels, whether they be parables or actual stories of what happened, what Jesus did, are anonymous. The main characters are anonymous, but not in this one. This is actually, as far as I understand, the only parable in the Gospels where a person, the main character, is named, Lazarus. And that's significant. Notice that the rich person is not named. Later on, there's tradition calls that person Dives. That was added later, but that's actually not in the text itself. In the text, just talks about the rich man and Lazarus. It's interesting too that we need to understand who Jesus is talking to, and when we have the lectionary readings, it often misses the context. So we need to understand who Jesus was talking to in this parable. And it says earlier on at the beginning of Luke chapter 16 that Jesus was talking to the Pharisees, and it specifically says who were lovers of money and who mocked him. That's what it specifically says at the beginning of chapter 16, which we didn't get in the lectionary reading from today. And that's significant as well. One guy I follow in the US, a pastor in Cincinnati, Paul Dazit, says the following about this story. He says that the rich man is nameless, but the beggar is named Lazarus. That reversal is intentional. In the world's eyes, the rich man's robes, and it says he was into fine dining and dressed very well and so on. The rich man's robes and banquets made him important in the world's eyes. In God's eyes, it was Lazarus who bore dignity and worth. And Jesus places himself with Lazarus, not with the wealthy at the table. And that should unsettle us. That should unsettle us. Because it means that when we look for Jesus in the halls of power or in the seats of privilege, we're looking in the wrong place. We won't find Jesus there. Jesus is waiting in the places that we'd rather not go. And we've seen that, especially in the US in the last couple of weeks with the assassination of Charlie Kirk and the memorial for him, where the whole thing of Christian nationalism and having Christianity as a thing of power and getting privilege was brought forward. And that's just not the way of Jesus that we see in the Gospels. Because one of the things we need to see again in the Gospels, and indeed throughout the New Testament and throughout the whole of the Scriptures, and we saw it in the passage from 1 Timothy today that we had read to us by Lorraine, was that there's a constant warning against the lure of riches. And those who preach a prosperity doctrine need to be aware of that. And more subtly, in a lot of churches, we see it here in Melbourne in some churches too, there's this whole blessing theology, that if I follow God, I'm going to get blessed in some way. It's a very subtle thing too, not quite in the whole overt prosperity sort of message, but it's there as well. We need to be very aware of the dangers of that. And in our society, here in Melbourne, in Australia, where we're among the richest nations on the planet, this story is really relevant to us as well. So it's in that context, in that conversation, that the Pharisees were there listening to Jesus, and it says specifically they were lovers of money and they mocked him, they ridiculed him. That Jesus tells this story of the rich man and Lazarus. Not the rich man, the poor man, but the rich man and Lazarus, who is named. So let's look at some of the details of this story. Firstly, with the rich man, we see there's a real sense of entitlement, a real sort of arrogance. Even after his death, he's being tormented in his death, and even then he wants Lazarus to do his bidding for him. When they were both alive, he would have walked out of his palace and probably literally walked over Lazarus, and so he would have noticed him there but ignored him. But when the rich man is the one who's being tormented, when the tables are turned, when the first are last and the last are first, then all of a sudden the rich man wants Lazarus to do something for him. And you can see and like in that culture too, very religious culture, the rich man was most likely religious as well. He talks about Father Abraham. He says to Abraham to send Lazarus to relieve him of his torment. And again, Paul Dazet says this about this part of the reading. He says that religion can bless our blindness when we get caught up in religion itself for the sake of it. He says the rich man still calls Abraham father. He still sees himself as part of the faith. But even in death, he treats Lazarus as someone beneath him, even in death, asking Abraham to send Lazarus like a servant, come and do my bidding. And this is a haunting warning, Paul Dazet says. Religious identity can mask our blindness. We can call ourselves faithful, attend church every week, go to Bible studies, quote scripture, and we can still fail to see the image of God in the one suffering at our gate. And that's the inequity that we see in the world. Those of us who are rich don't even realise how we torment the poor and how we benefit from their work, from what they do for us. And as I was preparing this message this week, I was reminded of a time about 15 years ago when I spent some time in New Delhi in India. My brother was working with IBM there at the time, and we stayed with him, and he was living in literal 5-star accommodation, marble floors, big swimming pools, servants to do everything you wanted, a driver to take you wherever you wanted to go. It was a gated community. But right outside the gated community were the slums where the people who built that community lived. And so the contrast, if you've ever been to a place like India, the contrast between rich and poor, literally right next to each other, is stark. It's really stark. At that time of year, it was about May when we were there, it was 44 degrees every day, unbelievably hot in New Delhi. And while we lived in air-conditioned comfort, the poor don't get that. They have to sit outside in the heat and suffer. I was working with World Vision at the time, and as part of that trip I went to visit the National Director of World Vision India, a guy called Jayakumar Christian, very appropriate name. He was a beautiful Christian man. And so I went to him and had a chat with him, and he'd written a book at the time called God of the Empty-Handed, in which he told stories about how God has a particular bias for the poor. And he would tell us that in a place like India, you don't need to convince people about God, because they have, a very Hindu background. They have thousands of gods, and Jesus is just one more God among many. And so one day, I realised there, talking to Jayakumar about my own middle class background, and one day we were stuck in traffic just outside of New Delhi, and it's, again, if you've been there, it just sort of bottlenecks the traffic does, and you just literally stopped for maybe half an hour at a time or longer. And when that happens, you're stuck in the traffic, beggars come up to your car and knock on the window and ask for money. Sometimes they even carry babies, which we're told they rent for sympathy. And the people that we were with in the car, and it wasn't Jayakumar, it was some other people, they told us to not make eye contact with the beggars who were knocking on our window. And I felt really bad about that. I thought, I don't want to ignore these people. But we were told to just look straight ahead, ignore them, don't look at them in the eye. And so afterwards, in my, call it guilt, I guess, about that, I talked to Jayakumar and I said, what do you do? What do you do when you see people like that, when they knock on your window like that and ask for money? And what he showed me, what he told me, was just how Christ-like he was as a man of God. He said that when the beggars come to his car, knock on the window, he winds down the window and he talks to them. Doesn't give them money and tell them to go away. He relates with them. He asks them their name. Maybe it was Lazarus. And he makes it personal. He gets to know them. Reminds me of a great book that Ash Barker, who started the UNO community here, Urban Neighbours of Hope, many years ago, who now lives in Birmingham in the UK, wrote a book called Make Poverty Personal. And it's about that. It's about what we see in this story today, where Jesus makes this personal. About 25 years ago, in the year 2000, the World Bank did a study called Voices of the Poor, in which they interviewed about 60,000 people around the world who live in abject poverty. And they asked those people living in poverty, what is poverty to you? What does it mean for you? So I'm going to ask you now to give me some responses. When you think of the word poverty, what words come to mind? Give me some responses. Homelessness. Yep. Starvation. Not having a voice. Yep.
Apparent connection with God.
No apparent connection with God. Yep. Anything else? Blessed. Blessed are the poor. Yep. Well, all those responses were what came out, but the overwhelming response to this study, where they interviewed these 60,000 people, was that poverty to people living in poverty was about a lack of a sense of dignity. A lack of a sense of dignity, a feeling of being trodden on, of being less than. All the other things like homelessness, other things were all real, but overwhelmingly it was a lack of a sense of dignity in their own worth. That was what they experienced. And that's the experience of Lazarus, literally being stepped over every day by this guy in fine clothes, ignored, wish he wasn't there, make me feel uncomfortable. And the rich guy would walk right past him. And in the Gospels, in the few stories where the people are named, like the blind Bartimaeus, for example, is another one, Lazarus in this story, they're the ones that are given the dignity that the world doesn't give them. They're the lowly who are lifted up. And we see that in Luke's Gospel. Luke's Gospel especially is a gospel that brings that across so strongly. We see it right from the start with Mary, with her Magnificat, where she talks about God sending the rich away empty and filling the hungry with good things, this great reversal, lifting the lowly. And we see it in the life of Jesus, how he treats outcasts and sinners, and how the religious people ignore him and they constantly berate him and ridicule him and mock him, like we see in this story as well. And so what we see in Luke's Gospel is this total upturning of the social order which Jesus talks about. It's in this Gospel that Jesus talks about the first being last and the last being first. And it's interesting that while in Matthew's Gospel we have the Sermon on the Mount, in Luke's Gospel we have the Sermon on the Plain. And I heard it said one time recently, that's probably no coincidence, because Jesus follows the example given by Isaiah, where it talks about the rough places being made smooth, the valleys being lifted up, and the mountains being laid low. Things being made plain and on a level place, where there's equity amongst all people. The last are first and the first are last. So we see in Luke's Gospel that ultimately God is a God who shows the poor their God-given dignity, and the dignity that's always actually been there but never been acknowledged. And in this story, Jesus acknowledges that. One of the great lessons I learned from Shirley Osborne when she was here, when she was a pastor here, was how she treated the poor with dignity. And often she mentioned, like, let's say when you see a person outside a supermarket, as I saw a couple of days ago. Those of us like me who are middle class can often make the excuse that, well, there's no point giving to them, they're probably going to use it on drugs or whatever. But then I think, well, what sort of arrogant attitude is that if I have that attitude? I've got no right to make that judgment. I don't know them. So I can't say that. And they've got if I've got a choice about how to use my money, they have a choice as well. So I can't make that judgment. So first, that's one attitude that I need to be aware of in myself. And secondly, if I'm going to treat someone with dignity, it would mean talking to them, getting to know their name as well. And one thing I do sometimes, as I did yesterday, was I ask them, can I go inside and get something for you? And so you can do that as well. It's pretty basic, it's pretty easy. And it's about the golden rule, about doing for others what we want them to do for us. Because Jesus said that sums up the entire law and the prophets. And this is where this story ultimately too is not just about how we treat the poor. I mean, it's about that. But it's not just that. It's a whole lot more than that. It shows that we're to care for the poor because we are followers of Jesus. Because we are followers of Jesus. And Jesus is giving this story as a warning to the Pharisees, like I mentioned, who have neglected the poor. And what Jesus calls elsewhere, they've neglected the weightier matters of justice, mercy and faithfulness, which he mentions in Matthew's Gospel. And then look at the very end of this story, where there's this talk about even if someone rises from the dead, they still wouldn't listen. Now, why would that be in this story? If it's just a story about let's care for the poor. Why would that part be in this story? So when the rich man says to send Lazarus to comfort him in his torment, and Abraham says no, the rich man then takes it further to say, well, let's send him to my family so he can warn them so they won't come to this place of torment as well. And that's when Abraham says, well, they've got Moses and the prophets. They should listen to them. Pretty stark warning as well. And Jesus, as usual, doesn't pull any punches with what he says. And he says that if his family won't listen to the Moses and the prophets, they certainly won't be convinced if someone rises from the dead. Because Jesus is, of course, referring to his own resurrection, his own setting right of all things that are wrong in the world. And Jesus is speaking and acting in the tradition of the prophets as well, who consistently railed against Israel, the people of God's injustice to the poor. Jeremiah, who we had read from today, said that a lot. Amos, Isaiah, all the prophets, Micah, did that. So Jesus is saying that listen to him, the one who's going to defeat death, who has defeated death, and everything that death entails. They should be listening to him. And we see that in the overarching narrative of the scriptures as well. We see in the scriptures there's more than 2,000 verses dedicated to the care of the poor. We're talking about God's concern for the poor and for justice. We see it in Genesis, where we see people made in the very image of the Creator with full dignity. And that's where the concept of human rights comes from. We see the creation of Israel as a nation, Abraham. Then we see the prophets, and they're talking about bringing people back to God. Then we see in Jesus hanging out with all the wrong people. We see the early church living together, sharing all they had in common, so no one was in need. We see Paul in Galatians saying that the whole law is summed up in the command to love our neighbour. And then in Revelation 21, right at the end, we see this great statement where heaven and earth are finally joined, and it says there'll be no more tears and no more pain and no more death, because the old order of things have finally passed away. That's the great Christian hope. Heaven and earth being joined together. Heaven coming here. Right here on earth. That's the great Christian hope that Revelation 21 talks about. Revelation 21, 1-5. Probably maybe my favourite passage in the whole Bible. When all sorts of poverty, not just material poverty, but what Jim Wallace of the Sojourners Committee in the US talks about, spiritual poverty as well. He talks about there's two sorts of poverty in the world. There's the material poverty and there's a spiritual poverty, which we see in the West. And we see so much here, where we see loneliness, anxiety, depression, domestic violence, off the charts, a lack of meaning, wondering about a reason to live despite the great material riches that we have. And again, I was reminded of another story that Shirley Osborne used to tell when she was here. And she told a parable about heaven and hell, which is interesting, related to this story that we have in the Gospels today. And she says that in hell there was a huge table with people around it, gathered for a feast, and there was food, there was just wine and everything, a bit like we have in the back there with the great food that's prepared for us here. But so much more than that as well. And that was what it was like in hell. And there were people around it, but all the people sitting around the table there were skinny, they were emaciated, they were malnourished, and they were close to death. And this person who had just died went there and saw that. And then he was shown a picture of heaven, where there was also a huge table with a feast and food and wine there as well, very similar. But the people around the table in heaven were well fed. They were happy, they were laughing, they were joyful. And there was a real sense of care amongst them. And the person who saw these two images, the one in hell where people were around this feast but they were close to death and they were emaciated and skinny, and yet the one in heaven where there was the same sort of image but they were well fed, he thought, why was this? And then he saw it. In hell, all the people had these really long spoons, and when they tried to get the food out of the pots, they couldn't bring it up to their mouths, and so they were hungry. In heaven, the people had the same long spoons, but they fed each other. They fed each other across the table, and so they were happy and well fed. They cared for each other, and so they had life. They were joyful. And I thought, what a great parable that is. What a great parable. Our self-centeredness is killing us, literally, in this society. Jesus said that the way to life is through loving our neighbour, including our enemies, the ones we don't want to love, the ones who are different to us, the Lazarus outside the supermarket. So however much we might want to weasel out of it, Jesus doesn't let us get away with not serving the poor and getting caught up in the lure of money. In the passage from 1 Timothy, it says that the love of money is the root of all evil. It's not so much about having money, but whether money has you. Whether money has you. And in Matthew 25, Jesus says that he identifies so closely with the hungry, the sick, the prisoner, that every time we either do feed them, do look after them, or we don't, we're doing that to Jesus. We're actually doing that to Jesus himself. He identifies so closely in Matthew 25, which he tells us about. So there's no way out of it. There's no way out of ignoring the poor, according to Jesus. That life is about service. It's about commitment, giving ourselves away for others. It's all about how we love our neighbour, whether we love our neighbour. And if we have to appeal to self-interest in doing that, then we're sort of missing the point as well, and we're missing out on life. Again, as I was preparing this, I was reminded about there's a cafe up in Cromwell Street, up in Collingwood, just not far from here, called Street Cafe. I don't know if you're aware of that place in Cromwell Street. I used to go there when I was working in Collingwood some years ago. The building that houses this cafe used to be a brothel many years ago, and now it's a social enterprise where marginalised people get jobs and they can serve and get an income. So I thought it's a great story of redemption from a place where women were exploited and harmed to a place where marginalised people can now get a hand up to get on their feet and realise their God-given dignity. So in the end, we can believe all we want about Jesus, but it's about how we serve, how we love. And again, Paul Dazet says this about what Jesus talks about resurrection. He says resurrection isn't enough without love. He says the rich man begs for a miracle to warn his brothers. Abraham insists they already have Moses and the prophets. If they won't listen, even resurrection won't change them. And Jesus is foreshadowing his own resurrection and warning us that miracles alone cannot break hardened hearts. If love is absent, even the most dazzling sign will not move us. Transformation comes not from spectacle, but from compassion. Transformation comes not from spectacle, but from compassion. Now, don't get me wrong, Jesus' resurrection changes everything. It changes everything. I believe in his physical resurrection. But it means nothing if it doesn't transform us from the inside out into people who are more Jesus-like, to become more faithful followers to that Jesus who aligns himself with Lazarus and with the Lazaruses of the world rather than the rich and the powerful. Amen.